Every single week, without fail, we get comments asking why we're covering up that Ukrainian men are being kidnapped off the street and forced into the military. And videos on social media show men being chased and handcuffed by mobilization officers, often with their partners crying and begging on the sidelines, which are heartbreaking scenes to anyone and certainly not something that seems like it should happen in a democracy. But the thing is, the shocking scenes shown in these videos, some fabricated and some indeed real, do nothing to paint an accurate picture of mobilization in Ukraine today. The real picture might not always be pretty, but it's far more nuanced than henchmen in vans snapping up helpless civilians and sending them to die. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be honest, one of the reasons we haven't done this episode yet is that it's a complex, but also very emotional subject for just about everyone in Ukraine, where around 1 in every 30-some people is serving in the military. Mobilization is omnipresent for everyone, whether you're a military-aged man or have family members, friends, or colleagues who are eligible. We're going to explain how mobilization actually works and try to straightforwardly dispel misconceptions. This episode is not an expose. The goal is not to paint Ukraine's system as barbaric or flawless, but rather to show just how complicated this issue really is. Now, before we can address how mobilization works, we have to address the state that the Ukrainian army was in before it went into full force. From 1991 to 2013, Ukraine had mandatory conscription, and this wasn't mobilization, but rather fixed-term military service that men were required to perform even in peacetime. This practice of conscripting and training all male citizens, most of whom returned to civilian life afterwards, is not unique to post-Soviet states in Europe. Countries like Finland and Switzerland do the same, requiring all men to do at least 1 year of military service, whether they want to be soldiers or not. This was Ukraine's system for the first 2+ decades of independence, and the military dwindled down from its Soviet numbers in that time. Just before the Euromaidan revolution in late 2013, then-President Viktor Yanukovych signed a decree doing away with conscription. And you can see how this fit into his broader attempt to defang Ukraine and bring it further under Russia's control. As such, conscription was immediately reinstated after the revolution that ousted Yanukovych. And by then, there was an immediate and increasingly urgent need for soldiers, because Russia was invading Crimea and the east, and there was an active war on Ukrainian territory for the first time in many decades. From 2014 to 2022, Ukraine would struggle with mixed methods of building and maintaining its military. It instituted partial but never full mobilization, with thousands of men receiving conscription notices every year, but many finding ways to ignore, escape, or get exemption from them. And that all changed in February of 2022. With the onset of martial law, all military-aged men in Ukraine were forbidden from leaving the country and required to register with enlistment authorities. Many joined the armed forces voluntarily, and others entered a period of waiting to see whether they'd be summoned. Many are still waiting to this day. When Russia launched the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had about 250,000 active duty service people. Russia, on the other hand, had about 850, although less than 200,000 of those took part in the initial full-scale invasion. Today, Ukraine has about 900,000 active duty soldiers. That's not counting paramilitaries and support staff, while Russia is estimated to have around 1.5 million active. Now that means that Russia's army has about doubled in size, while Ukraine's has nearly quadrupled. Now, the thing that makes Ukraine's military growth so staggering is the proportion. Russia's population is estimated in the range of 140 million people. Now, Ukraine's is somewhere around 30 million, diminished significantly over the last few years. And about half of those 30 million people in Ukraine are men, and within that, somewhere in the range of a third are fit for service. So when you add in the fact that Russia is maintaining its army without mobilizing Russians, you can see last week's episode about imported fighters from African countries, among other tactics to recruit from vulnerable populations, it means that mobilization really is not an immediate worry for Russian men, and it is in fact a very immediate prospect for many Ukrainian men. It should be noted that the early days of the full-scale invasion were defined by lines of Ukrainian men standing outside military offices without being summoned, volunteering to defend their country. And to this day, volunteers who joined in the early days and more recently still make up an enormous part of the armed forces. There are benefits and incentives for those who volunteer versus those who are mobilized, including more control over one's placement after boot camp, because a good role that you pick yourself is often preferable to being assigned to the area of greatest need, and volunteering can be a more stable and predictable option for those with useful transferable skills. But over time, as casualties mount and those serving for years become increasingly exhausted without sufficient personnel for rotations, volunteers haven't been able to compensate for the growing manpower shortage, and mobilization has become increasingly important. We spoke to a representative from the 3rd Assault Corps who told us a bit more about how the work of recruiters in Ukraine has changed over time.
At the moment, Ukraine has both mobilization service and contract service. What is a direct contract? It can be a standard direct contract, a 60-plus contract for people over the age of 60, or the 18 to 24 contract. Under a separate provision on the service of candidates aged 18 to 24, these soldiers receive a cash payment of 1 million hryvnias. Until 2025, I was involved in recruiting for a specific unit, one brigade. Now I have moved into a larger role, and other people have taken over my previous position. And in fact, there has been no decline in the number of recruits. The number of people joining units has remained stable. If we take the 3rd Assault Brigade as an example, the number of personnel joining each month is stable. It's hard to say which roles are the most popular among volunteers. We have many units, and drone operators typically go directly to drone units. Each person has options. It's not as though everyone wants the same role. We are working to ensure that all roles are staffed. Every position in the army is important. As for freedom of choice, people are afraid of uncertainty, ending up in the wrong unit or position. In our case, we show contract soldiers that with us, there's a 100% guarantee from the recruiter that they'll get the unit and position they want. If all units provided the same paperwork and guarantees, things would improve. As for those who are mobilized, they used to have the opportunity to choose their unit. Then, for some reason, that changed. But it's a fairly simple story. Because people are wanted for evading service, they don't join the army. The law stipulates that, in the event of military aggression, citizens must defend their country. Democracy should not work in only one direction. It works both ways. If you use social benefits, you are a citizen of Ukraine, you consider yourself that, you are Ukrainian, then you must also defend Ukraine.
Growing an army while under attack for years is a difficult mathematical gambit. You need people to keep volunteering after the most motivated have already joined, and the goal is for as many people to cooperate with mobilization as possible, even as casualties mount and more information emerges about the brutal reality of the front. And we are not going to sugarcoat this. It is a fact that the front line becomes more deadly by the year as drones evolve. Soldiers who come back from Russian captivity tell horrific stories of torture and maltreatment. And the Ukrainian military system is not without fault. Cases of mismanagement and abuse can have devastating effects on morale and motivation at all levels. And as I alluded to, Ukraine doesn't have nearly enough personnel to rotate out. The common understanding is that once started, military service lasts until Ukraine can relax its defensive posture, which wouldn't happen immediately even if a ceasefire was reached. As such, a senior Ukrainian official speaking anonymously told the Kyiv Independent last August that Ukraine is mobilizing around 30,000 men per month, roughly a third of which end up being fit for military service. The Defense Ministry has reported fluctuations in volunteer enlistment over time, but as of 2024, the ratio was 1 volunteer for every 3 mobilized soldiers, according to officials. Whether entered into voluntarily or by appointment, the bottom line is that military service in Ukraine is an indefinite commitment with undeniable dangers and stakes. So isn't it logical that people would be resistant to that? We'll get into it after a quick pause. If you've ever wondered how the Kyiv Independent publishes its reporting without paywalls or subscriptions, I'll tell you, it's thanks to you. We keep things public and unbiased by relying on donations from our community, the very people who read and follow our work. We're currently on a mission to add 4,000 names to that list, and we're already more than a quarter of the way there. Which means if you join now, you'll be a key part of our most historic fundraising event of all time. For as little as $5 a month in almost any currency, you can directly participate in building the future of independent journalism in Ukraine. And for more information, you can visit the link in the description below. The first step of mobilization usually comes in the form of a notice sent by mail to a home or a workplace, telling a man to report to his local enlistment office to make sure that his documents are up to date. Men of all ages are supposed to have an app called Reserve Plus on their phone, which shows their documentation, and it's that mobilization officers ask to see when they stop someone in the street. If it's discovered that you haven't updated your information and are wanted for breaking the law, you'll likely be taken straight from the scene to the enlistment office, while others might get a few days to put their affairs in order. Might, because there are no guarantees. This can happen on any street, anywhere in Ukraine, at any time of day. Even the foreign men who work at the Kyiv Independent get stopped every now and then and have to show proof that they're foreigners. As I said in the introduction, one of the most vivid and disturbing ideas about mobilization in Ukraine is that it mainly consists of forceful arrests on the street, with recruits who are begging desperately for their freedom. Now, does this happen? I'll be honest with you. Yes, occasionally it does. But it's not the norm, or rather, it's on an extreme end of the spectrum of mobilization in Ukraine. There are men who don't go out because they're afraid of such encounters. There are men who've retreated into the woods in western Ukraine where they're unlikely to be found. In Kyiv, there are social media channels that use code words to indicate where the mobilization officers are in the city so that people can avoid going there. But there are also millions of Ukrainian men going about their normal lives, knowing that they could be stopped and sent to an enlistment office at any time. And that might sound crazy, but think about it. The options are to go into hiding for years on end, or to accept the risk and continue living. Now, I'm not a military-aged Ukrainian man, so I can't say exactly what that feels like. But at least in my experience of talking to people, there can be fear and anxiety and dread and uncertainty alongside an understanding of the bigger picture and the acceptance of the absoluteness of the law. Of the handful of people I know who've been mobilized unexpectedly, all handled it calmly and bravely. They knew it was a possibility, they understood why it was necessary, and all have successfully integrated into military life. This is not everyone's story, but I'm telling you anecdotally that it's a far more common story than that of kidnapping and coercion by mobilization officers, many of whom at this point are veterans themselves. And as ill will towards these officers grows among the public, they're at increased risk of violence for performing what is undeniably their assigned task. Attacks and other forms of violent assault have grown rapidly over the years. Videos showing men breaking down or otherwise being forced into service are extremes. They're not representative of the average mobilization experience, which is why it benefits Russia and other bad faith actors to doctor and amplify them as if they are the norm. By giving the impression that Ukraine is forcing people to fight, and that Ukrainians really don't want to do so, Russia can claim that Ukraine's ongoing defense is the wish of the government, not the people. This is false. While a 2024 poll found that over half of Ukrainians surveyed could empathize with people who avoid mobilization, no polls conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology since 2022 have shown a dip below 50% in public support for continuing the war until a fair outcome for Ukraine is achieved, and that is not possible without mobilization. The Ukrainian government's initial attempts to mitigate the personnel shortage largely focused on incentivizing volunteers, and mainly those younger than 25. But the results haven't been great. Contracts with short terms, high signing bonuses, and other perks designed to attract volunteers below the mandatory mobilization age have failed to bring in sufficient numbers, with the Defense Ministry estimates placing total volunteer numbers in the 4 digits from 2024 to 2025, simply not enough to compensate for what the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimate are over 500,000 Ukrainian casualties since 2022. Ukraine has undertaken various initiatives to reform its mobilization processes, both in logistical terms with digitization and culturally, particularly when it comes to corruption and abuses. There have been efforts to crack down on enlistment offices accepting bribes and forging medical documents to exempt people from service, as well as efforts to curb violence and other rough behavior from the officers tasked with approaching people on the street. There has also been talk of completely reworking the system of officers stopping people at random, instead replacing them with a more targeted selection system. Although the Defense Ministry claims that this is in the works, the details are hazy. President Zelensky has also stated the need for fixed service terms and guidelines for eventual demobilization and discharge, something that's been on the docket a few times but has never yet made it through. He's also stated that after a ceasefire, he hopes Ukraine can have a volunteer-only army, something that feels far away now. We're joined by Viktor Kevliuk, Reserve Colonel and expert at the Center for Defense Strategies. Recently, Zelensky has been talking about, fixed-term contracts and other kind of changes to the overall system. Are there any kind of thoughts about whether those might work or whether things might get better?
Imagine a situation where you inherit a 15th century castle. People tell you that the building needs major renovation. But all you do is clean up the garden, change the entrance gate, and paint the door a fun, bright color. The same thing is happening with mobilization in Ukraine. What is being proposed, first of all, is just talk. These are not initiatives that have reached the Ukrainian parliament in the form of bills and could actually change something. This is a cosmetic repair of the system that will not yield any results. In my opinion, Ukrainian politicians have chosen a very wrong path with mobilization. They are trying to avoid the issue of mobilization, putting ratings first, their own and those of their political forces, as well as some hypothetical elections that may or may not take place, because there might be nowhere for them to take place. Instead of implementing a set of measures, political, economic, and financial, which Ukrainian legislation obliges them to implement. This is a huge problem that everyone is hiding from, trying to shift responsibility onto territorial centers for recruitment and social support. But they, according to law, perform purely technical work. They keep military records. The state is trying in every way to evade the obligation to be tough, to be strict, and to implement measures that are absolutely unpopular among the population. This is the first problem. The fact that 2 to 4 million citizens in Ukraine are not registered for military service and it is not clear where they are is something the state does not want to deal with. Another problem that personally bothers me a lot is the inaction of the Culture Ministry, which is responsible for information policy. Why isn't there a massive, active, aggressive information campaign about the need for people to update their military registration and enlist in the ranks of the defense forces? Who should be doing this? We have a specialized ministry that is responsible for it, the Culture Ministry. There is a Department of Information Policy there. Why don't they explain the benefits of military service during a special period, during hostilities? Why doesn't anyone tell us what social support the families of people called up for mobilization receive? Why isn't it being covered on a massive scale when the state is actually supporting the families of people who are currently performing military duty? Therefore, until the state, represented by politicians who implement various policies in our country, says, "No, stop, we have to win the war, and for this we have to take a dozen or two very unpopular steps," we will not turn our attention to those people who are now part of the defense forces and who are ensuring that people deep in the Ukrainian rear can enjoy their lavender coffee. This is how it works.
At the end of the day, non-voluntary mobilization is a really uncomfortable topic. It calls to mind American men escaping to Canada to avoid being sent to Vietnam. But the brutal truth is that this is an invasion that Ukraine didn't ask for, and the only way out is through. Ukraine needs a military in order to continue existing, and militaries are made up of people. There's a tendency outside Ukraine to discuss mobilization like it's a tap that can be turned on and off at will, or like it's one of several possible solutions that Ukraine has gone for. It isn't. Ukraine having a well-staffed and growing military is the only way that Ukraine has survived and will continue to survive. There is not an alternative option. There have been real problems within mobilization, and those issues deserve scrutiny, and Ukrainian society debates them constantly in lawmaking chambers and living rooms across the country. Reducing the entire process to clips of men being dragged into vans ignores both the pressing need for manpower and the thousands of people who bravely comply with mobilization, volunteer for service, and do what's needed for Ukraine's defense. Arguments against mobilization seem to imply that if Ukrainian men decline to fight, things will eventually work out okay, and that only works if your definition of okay is being murdered and occupied by Russia. None of this makes mobilization easy or legally/politically uncomplicated. It goes against instinctive ideas about personal freedom under democracy. But the reality is that freedom is not free. There has always been a cost. And as I say with so many topics, if you find it unpleasant and wish to take action, direct your energy not at the country being invaded, but the one doing the invading. The sooner Russia ends its war, the sooner the Ukrainian military will be voluntary.
This week's member question is, if a Russian costs $50 million a shot and does so little damage, why does Russia keep firing them instead of using cheaper missiles like Iskander? Well, the main and almost sole reason is for propaganda reasons. Russia still needs to prove both to a domestic audience and an international audience, particularly NATO, that it is a big, scary superpower country that needs to be feared. And Oreshnik is sort of a middle ground between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. And they can't use it with conventional warheads because it's impossible to equip, well, not impossible, but Russia doesn't have the technical expertise to equip a missile that travels that fast with conventional warheads. So it's been used 3 times in Ukraine now. And each time it's had sort of dummy warheads, essentially big, huge lumps of metal that hit the ground at a really high speed and do very little damage. And this did have the effect, and definitely the first time they used it, a little less so the second time they used it, in that it made Russia appear like it had a big, fearsome weapon that it can wave around and threaten to make itself look big and important. But there's been a real shift after this third attempt, because it's now really clear that without a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead, it does really little damage, it's really expensive, and it's not actually anything to fear. The reason why Russia keeps firing them is because they don't really have any other weapons in their arsenal that are below the nuclear threshold that they can use to sort of scare Ukraine and to scare the West and NATO. But an important caveat on that at the end, they will be learning and getting a lot of data on the launches of these missiles, and with new weapon systems like this, that's always very useful. Until then, it's just going to become weaker and weaker as a weapon of propaganda. And I mean, Russia can still fire them at them and waste $50 million every time, or it will realize that it's not working and having the same intimidation effect, and it will stop using them. We'll have to see.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. And for those of you who joined this month, you'll be taking part in a historic step forward for us. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.